This is Gareth Aden of the Nashville Bar Association, and it is my honor and privilege today to be talking with John J. Hollins, Sr., one of the most distinguished members of the trial bar in Nashville, Tennessee. This interview is being done as a part of the Oral History Initiative of the Nashville Bar Association and the Tennessee Bar Foundation. John, if you would, let's begin where depositions generally do. Could you tell us your full name, where you were born, and when you were born?
Okay, my full name is John Jordan Hollins. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee on November the 12th, 1932. I'm 77 years old.
John, could you tell us a little bit about your family history?
Yes, my family has been in Nashville since before the Civil War. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather were in the shoe business, wholesale shoe business on the public square. The name of the company was R.S. Hollins and Sons. And that company broke in the early part of the Great Depression, which was in the 1920s. Most of the depression, as you know, was in started in 32. I was born in 32. My family had been well-to-do till the Great Depression, and after the Great Depression, we weren't as well-to-do. My father had several jobs. He worked for the WPA, works projects administration, worked for the United States Treasury Department, and lastly for the National Stores Corporation.
How about your mother? Was she a Middle Tennessean?
Mother was Middle Tennessean. Interestingly enough, her father, Morris Sharp, had the roads built in Edwin Warner Park and Percy Warner Park. He was a magistrate here. Her family was reasonably well-to-do, and the family farm was later made into the Englewood Country Club.
Where was the family home, John, while you were growing up?
Well, I started off living in the Hillsborough Village at 1916 20th Avenue North. In 1945, I moved to Gallatin Road. My mother and father and I moved to Gallatin Road, where we lived with my two great aunts, Fanny Owen Walton and Alice Donaldson Walton, from 1945 to 1958, when I married Carol Sue.
You know, one thing I want to ask you about, because you mentioned it to me earlier, and that is, I believe that your grandfather had a very interesting history after the Civil War.
Well, that was my great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather was put in prison by the Yankees because he failed to take an oath to support the Union. And that was frequent in those days among prominent families. And if your family was really prominent, they put you in a penitentiary in another state.
In growing up, where did you go to elementary and
Went to Aiken Elementary School. I started the MBA when I was 12 years old in 1945, and I finished at MBA.
I've got to ask you this because Aiken was my school also. Was Ida Trimble the principal while you were there?
Ida Trimble was not, but she was one of my teachers.
How about that?
Mariah Page was my principal, but Ms. Trimble was one of my teachers.
Well, she was important in my life, and I'm sure she was quite a teacher then. What about MBA? What things stand out about your years there?
It was a turning point in my life. I started MBA in the 7th grade when I was 12. Before that time, I hadn't liked to go to school and only went to school about half the time because my mother was very indulgent. If I'd tell her I didn't feel like going to school, she wouldn't make me go. But the first 6 weeks there, I had a low grade in math. I had to come back on Saturday, and I resolved that I would never again come back to Saturday school.
Were there any teachers there at MBA?
Yeah, Ms. Bitzer, who later became Ms. Lowry, is the greatest teacher that I ever had in high school, college, or law school. And she started me memorizing poems and other things, and was an important person in my life.
You had a brother, I think.
I had a brother named Lunsford, Lunsford, who went by the name of Lunny, who was a gifted athlete.
And he ended up, I think, playing some very good football at
He
Vanderbilt.
He went to Vanderbilt about 36 through 39. He was not as big as I am. He was 5'9", but he played quarterback on offense with a single wing, and you could only substitute once then in a quarter, so he had to play safety on defense. He was a gifted athlete, could do anything.
Now, I think during high school you had an accident.
I did. I had a gun blow up in my face.
All right, and you lost an eye.
Lost
in
an
that
eye.
accident. What about in the summer times? John, what did you do during the high school years? What was it like then?
Well, of course, we played in the neighborhood there on 20th Avenue, and we played games like kick the can. I went to Glen Echo some when I was living on 20th Avenue in the summers. And there, you know, I would catch fish, and play in the spring, and look at the muskrats and the skunks and the other animals that inhabited that property. And
my guess is that in that period of time, when you got to MBA, you were getting pretty far out of town.
I was. I rode the bus for 5 cents from in front of Spring Hill Cemetery to MBA.
How were
You got to transfer to the West End bus from the Inglewood bus.
Now, did Ms. Lowry and the other teachers at MBA change your grades from that very first
They
period?
did. I made very good grades at MBA in the annual for 1951, which was the year I graduated. They referred to me as an English brain.
Tell us a little bit about where you went on to college and how you got there.
I went to Vanderbilt. I had some kind of an academic scholarship at MBA because my family didn't have a lot of money at that time. I had some kind of an academic scholarship at Vanderbilt. I later was a senior at Absentia, which means that I had a good enough grade point average and had enough quality points to go to law school my 4th year. And that's what I did.
Where did this interest in law come from? Kind of tell us how that happened.
Really started, my father knew a lawyer named Will Norval when he was going to Vanderbilt, and he was a lawyer, and he probably had something to do with me getting into MBA on a scholarship. But then at MBA, my junior year, I took a course in business law, and I liked the law. I liked the legal words.
How about your undergraduate professors? Did you have any that you felt were important to you in the rest of your life?
I did. I was a political science major. Most of the professors were pretty good. Judge Nixon's father, who I believe his name was Herman Nixon, taught me politics and pressure groups. Judge Williams' daughter taught me one political science course. There were some excellent English professors at that time whose names I don't all recall, but they were well known to Vanderbilt alumni.
In that period was the Chancellor Harvey Branscombe?
Chancellor Harvey Branscombe was chancellor.
Right.
We called him the Big White Rabbit.
John, I'm fascinated that your senior year in undergraduate school was actually spent at law school. Is that correct?
That's true. I got my BA degree at the end of my first year in law school.
Where was law school held at that time?
Kirkland Hall.
So right there.
Second floor, second and third floor, right.
Now your class, and I think that your class at the law school was a very famous class.
Famous class of 57.
Tell us about that class and some of the people that you attended school with.
Well, Jim Neal was in that class. Jim and I were very close. He's still one of the best lawyers that I've ever known. We took some vacations together. John J. Hooker was a member of that class. John J. didn't start in our class, but he finished in our class. L. Abbey was in that class. Bill Henry, who later became Federal Communications Commissioner. Oh, I could give you a lot of other names. They probably wouldn't.
Was Bill Willis in that class?
Bill Willis was not in that class. Bill's a little older than I am.
Very good. What about law school stands out in your recollection?
Well, the thing that stands out in my recollection, Gareth, is that I learned a lot more from the other students than I did from the professors, although I had some great professors, including Eddie Morgan, who was 84 when he taught me. He and McGuire had written a book on evidence. He's probably the greatest teacher in law school that I had.
John, your interest in law, it was while you were in law school, did you determine what type of practice you were interested in, or was that something that sort of evolved later?
I wanted to try cases.
Okay.
Even from the start.
You knew early on sort of where you wanted your career to
Absolutely.
go. You graduated in 1957. Were you still a bachelor at that time?
Yes, I was.
And had you met the love of your life?
I had met Carol Sue, and we were married about a year after I graduated from law school.
Tell us a little bit about Carol Sue, where she was from.
Carol Sue had lived in Chattanooga, and her parents had moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where her mother and father opened a dry cleaning business, had several locations there.
When you and Carol Sue married in 1958, where did you live at that time?
We lived at 4502 Harpeth Hills Drive. I had inherited a little money, which gave us enough for a down payment on that house. And we lived there for 9 years.
Did you start your family right away?
Yeah, Laura was born, our oldest was born in 1959. John was born 2 years later, and Carol 4 years after John was born.
Now, I think it's probably no surprise to anyone, but your son, John Hollins Jr., is now practicing with you and has been for many years.
John's a very good lawyer. I wouldn't say as good as I am yet, but he's getting there.
Wonderful. Tell us about your daughters and sort of where they went to school and what they've done.
Laura went to Harpeth Hall and then finished up at St. Bernard. John went to MBA like I did. They all went to Oak Hill Grade School, which is a school that our church, First Presbyterian Church, sponsors. And then Carol went to St. Bernard, and later she was afraid she was not learning enough to go to college, transferred to Franklin Road Academy.
And what are you? I know that your son is a very fine and well-known trial practitioner here in Nashville. What are your daughters doing now?
Okay, my son's, as you say, is practicing law here. My daughter Carol is the manager of Chico's, which is a ladies' store in Green Hills. My daughter Laura, after college, lived in Manhattan for 12 years and was in high fashion. She hasn't been back here all that long. She moved back here when my wife lost a short-term memory. She was working for a magazine in Miami prior to that time, and now she does cosmetics, sales, and work here in Nashville.
John, where are you and Carol Sue living now?
We live at 5319 Lancelot Road. We have a Brentwood address, but it's really in Nashville, Davidson County, Tennessee.
And have the two of you lived there for a long time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think since 68.
As long as I can
We built
remember.
that house. We built that house.
Exactly, and then that house is the one I associate with you. How about your son practicing law? We're going to come back to this later.
Sure.
But did you promote that, or?
I didn't really promote it, but I wanted him to.
Let's start now with your career. I think after your graduation in 1957, you went with a private firm.
Did. I went with J. Ross Cheshire Jr., T.T. McCarley, R.R. Schulman, and J. Conley Edwards.
At that time, give us a little, well, let me just start with salary. How much was your starting salary at the firm?
First year I made about, I didn't have any salary. The first year I made about $5,000.
And was that considered doing fairly well for a
Reasonably well. The top lawyers, when I started practicing law, Gareth, maybe made $15,000.
Things have changed.
Oh, it changed a lot.
What was the bar in Nashville like when you first joined in the late 50s?
Not near as many. I want to say when I was president of the bar in 1954, there were probably 600 lawyers. So I'm sure there was not over half of that when I started.
People are going to want to know, and I think I do too, although I didn't follow you by that long. But how did you get started in practice? How did that work?
Well, lawyers in that firm gave me cases and told me to go to court and try them. And so I learned how to do that.
What type of practice did the old, I knew it as the McCarley Schulman firm, but what type of practice?
Well, Schulman was a real estate lawyer, probably the best real estate lawyer in the state of Tennessee at that time. Ross Cheshire and McCarley did mostly insurance defense, some plaintiff's work. J. Conley Edwards was older then. He had a few big clients left, like Firestone and New York Life.
What about the larger firms and the more notable attorneys while you were a young practitioner? Tell us a little bit about that.
The lawyers that I learned to practice law from or try cases from were Jack Norman Sr., John Hooker Sr., John Connors, who started off as an insurance defense lawyer and later was a plaintiff's lawyer.
Right.
They were all very good lawyers. Jimmy Bass, was a very good lawyer, and he could try a case or handle business practice.
Was Bass, Berry and Sims up and
Good
going
law
at
firm
that
then
time?
and still is. And they were in the American Trust building where we were.
Wasn't just about everyone.
Everybody was. The whole firm was in there. Good Pasture, Carpenter, and Woods was in there.
Exactly. Was Waller Lanston?
Waller Lanston was in there.
You mentioned John Hooker Sr., who was a favorite of mine. Did you get to know Mr. Hooker?
Knew him well, and got to be, I tried some cases against him, and he took a liking to me, and he would frequently around 5:30 in the afternoon call me and say, "John, would you like to have a little drink?" And I would go into his office, and he and I would have a little drink.
Some of the greatest afternoons of my early life were spent in that library at the Hooker Keeble Dodson.
He was a great storyteller.
He was, and loved to tell stories.
Made a great argument too in a criminal, in any kind of case.
Did you get to try some cases
I did.
against or with Mr. Hooker?
I did. First big case I tried was against Mr. Hooker, and this is the first big case I tried as an assistant district attorney. This was probably about 63, and this was a bribery case involving the sheriff of Humphreys County, Lurton McNeil, and the head of the alcohol and tobacco unit in the state of Tennessee, and we won. They were both very good lawyers, and we were expected to lose, but we won. And I will never forget in all my life when the reporters were out there talking together during a recess. One of them was saying, "Who is that guy Hollins?" Nobody knew about me, but we won.
That must have been a terrific moment in your life, especially with a lawyer with the kind of the renown of John Hooker on the other side.
But he's very gracious.
He always was.
Gracious in losing
Exactly.
and complimentary of the way I tried the case.
My notes show, John, that in about 1961, you began practicing as a city attorney for Nashville.
That's true. At that time, Gareth, and then later in the district attorney's office, the salary is so low that you were permitted to carry on a civil practice in addition to working for the city or the state.
Very good. What, during the 2 or 3 years that you were with the city attorney's office, tell us a little bit about what your practice was like, what type of cases that you handled for the city.
Okay, it was actually 2 years, from 61 to 63. I prosecuted in city court. Andrew Dole was the judge. I tried some of the sit-in cases. The sit-ins started in 1960, and Walter Leva tried most of the early ones. But I tried some sit-in cases. I represented the beer board. I represented the city in the appeal of the Sunday closing cases. Andrew Dole declared those laws unconstitutional, and I had to appeal those. I also, helped with some other litigation.
Young lawyers may not even know the name of Andrew Doyle, but he was a big part of my early life at the bar. Tell us a little bit about Andrew Doyle. He was the city judge, am I
That's
right?
right. He was a consummate politician. He, one of his chief political supporters was a black man named Good Jelly Jones, who had a market. And when the sit-in cases would come up before Doyle, he would frequently appoint a special judge to hear those cases because he didn't want to get crosswise with Good Jelly Jones. And he appointed Carl Hardin in some of my cases. He appointed John I. Harris in some other cases.
Well, he had a rule that I didn't learn about till much later, but as I understand the rule was that when you were a young attorney, you generally won the first case in his court.
I don't really remember that, Gareth, but Judge Dole had his favorites. He liked me, and he told people, even, if he knew it was raining outside and I said the sun was shining, he would believe me.
What about who was the director of law at that time for
Bob
the city?
Jennings. Very good lawyer.
And Bob ended up having a very distinguished career, and I think he represented a number of municipalities in Middle
He
Tennessee.
did. I know he
later on.
represented the city of Brentwood.
Now, after 2 years, in about 1963, you went to the district attorney's office.
That's true.
Is that correct? Who was the DA at that time?
Harry Nickel.
And tell us about practicing in the district attorney's office in the early 60s. What was it like, and who was there?
It was interesting. I had first declined an offer to take that job a year before when Harris Gilbert had resigned. This time, Doug Fisher was resigning, and Doug and I were good friends, and he told me that I really ought to do this, and so I did.
How did you like the criminal practice?
Never had tried a criminal case before I went with the district attorney's office. First case I tried was a murder case, and I got a conviction for voluntary manslaughter. So I figured I'd arrived by then.
You know, John, I know vaguely from my recollection and from talking with you and other attorneys of about your age, that the early 60s was a period of a good deal of turmoil and change in Nashville.
Absolutely.
And I think you were a part of that, and wondered if you could tell us what you recall about it, who were the notable figures, and
Sure. Well, in 1960, someone blew up Z. Alexander Luby's house.
tell us who he was.
Z. Alexander Luby, I think, was born in the West Indies. He was a black man who handled many of the civil rights cases at that time.
Okay.
And I remember very well that as young lawyers, George Barrett and Bill Willis and I drew up a resolution that we hoped the Bar Association would adopt, condemning the bombing of Luby's house because of people that he was representing. But we didn't do very well with some older conservative members of the bar. They first said, well, you don't really know why his house was bombed. And besides that, he's sort of hard to get along with.
Did you have any involvement yourself with any of the cases that arose out of the sit-ins at the lunch counters here in
I remember
Nashville?
two, and I've got various scrapbooks, and these cases are both written up in the scrapbooks. I tried the case involving the Cross Keys restaurant, which I believe at that time was on 6th Avenue. And I remember trying the case involving the TikTok Cafe, which was on Church Street. I know that in the Cross Keys case, there were 14 defendants. Carl Hardin, as special judge, found them all guilty. I know that in the TikTok case, the owner of the TikTok restaurant was also charged because he had squirted one of the sit-inners with a fire extinguisher.
Who was the mayor of Nashville?
Ben West.
Okay, and he was, I think, instrumental in helping bring people together.
He absolutely was. And this began really on May the 19th. That may have been the day they blew up Luby's house of 1960. And then there was this march, student march, mostly students. It was Tennessee A&I at that time, not Tennessee State like it is now, and Fisk University. They started marching out there and marched all the way to the courthouse and up the steps and talked to Ben West. And I remember that Diane Nash was one of the sit-inners, and C.T. Vivian, who was a minister, was with her. And Diane Nash tried to shame, and did shame, I guess, Mayor West, saying, you know, did he think this was ethical, that they should not serve these black people in restaurants? And he told her no, he didn't think that that was equitable, and he would do what he could to try to get the restaurants to serve the black students, and he did.
Who else? And I know there were some really distinguished folks, but during the period that you served as district attorney from 1963 through 1969, who were some of the other people in that office that you remember?
Howard Butler was a vigorous prosecutor. Yale Robinson prosecuted in that office. John Cole was an investigator, and Charlie Hunter was an investigator. And I worked, very closely with them in developing some of these cases, or preparing these cases for trial.
Were there any young DAs in your later years there that went on to distinguished careers, people that you helped mentor?
Well, Tom Schreier was in my class. He ran for district attorney and was elected after Harry Nickel retired. Bob Brandt was in that office. Schreier went in '66. Dick Spate was in that office. Clark Tedwell was in that office. I think Al Webby was in that office.
Was Aaron Wyckoff in there before you had left?
He may have been. I'm just not sure about Aaron.
You've mentioned one of the better known of the cases that you were involved in prosecuting in the DA's office, but I'll bet you there's another one or two you'd like to tell us about.
The last case I tried involved 3 black power people that came down here from Cincinnati and killed 2 policemen. One named Thomason and one named Johnson. And they were Parker, Kennedy, and Allen. That was the last big case I tried. I tried it in December of '69, and my best recollection is they went on for 25, 26 days. They were all convicted. They all were sentenced to 99 years in the penitentiary.
What about judges? John. The history of judges in the Nashville courts, and in particular the criminal courts, sometimes gets forgotten. Tell us about the great judges, or the judges you remember practicing before, and what they were
Sure.
like.
I started off practicing in Raymond Leather's court. That was Division I. He was a very bright guy and a good judge. After I went with the district attorney's office in '63, I soon became Harry Nichols' fair-haired boy. And then I would transfer from his court to John Draper's court, depending on how big the case was.
And I think I first...
Draper was a great judge, too.
Yeah, and I remember you from Judge Draper's court, because I think I got appointed to a case years ago in that court. What did you decide to do? You'd made a really good and growing reputation as a prosecutor, but I think in 1969 you went back to full-time private practice.
That's true.
Kind of tell us about that decision and where you went.
I don't say that I got bored with the prosecution case, because I still like to try most any kind of case. I just thought it was time that I returned to full-time private practice. I wanted to represent defendants in criminal cases and try both criminal and civil cases, and that's what I did.
Before we leave that really important part of your career, I wanted to ask you for your observations about what makes a good prosecutor, because I know you've had a lifetime of thinking about that.
Well, I think in our conversation at lunch, I told you that it's really not that hard to be a good trial lawyer, and it's surprising that so few do it well. You don't have to be brilliant. You got to have a reasonable amount of intelligence. You got to work like hell, and you got to have good judgment. And the good judgment, the judgment part is the most elusive. I think you got to have a burning desire to win, and I had that.
Yes.
And all the good prosecutors I've known had that.
That really does seem to be a common denominator. When you went back to your private practice, did you set up your shop at the Schulman McCarley
Yes, I
firm
did.
also?
I did, but I left that firm in '75.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about your practice when you went back. What areas of law did you develop? And sort of...
Still tried a lot of insurance defense cases, which I'd tried before. A lot of plaintiffs' cases, but now, see, I was on the other side, so I could try criminal cases. And Ed Yarbrough came with us in '76, and he and I worked together closely on cases. Ed was there when Jeffrey Womack came to see us about the Marsha Trimble case. Ed was there when we represented Eddie Shaw, who was the Commissioner of Transportation under Ray Blanton.
Well, you've mentioned the case that I think I was certainly wanted you to talk about to the extent that you would like to, because it's a case that in the memories of lawyers and citizens of Nashville, you certainly stand out in, and that's a very famous case of Marsha Trimble's murder. Tell us what happened and how you became involved in it.
I had represented a woman in a divorce case whose name was Peggy Morgan. Jeffrey Womack worked some for Peggy Morgan. They've lived in the same neighborhood, and also Marsha Trimble lived in the neighborhood. The police Jeffrey was only 15 years old at the time, as I recall, 15 or 16.
And this was in a neighborhood sort of in the Green Hills area?
Yes, on Copeland Drive.
Okay.
Jeffrey, for whatever reason, was being interviewed at the Trimble home. And the police had sort of staked that out as a place where they would interview witnesses and work out of. And Peggy called me and said that the police had kept Jeffrey Womack in a bedroom there and were questioning him and giving him a bad time. And she thought I ought to talk to him. And within a day or so, Jeffrey's parents made an appointment to come in and brought Jeffrey in to see me.
By way of background for those who might not be familiar, tell us a little bit about what had happened to Marcia Trimble, or at least what people knew at that time had happened.
Well, at this time, Marcia Trimble had disappeared on February the 25th, 1975.
Young girl?
Young girl, 9 years old. She was out selling Girl Scout cookies. Her body was not found until some 33 days later on Easter Sunday in a garage of a house belonging to John Thorpe and his wife. Now, Jeffrey came to see me before the body was found. My practice was at that time, in all criminal cases or significant criminal cases, to first have a qualified polygraph operator give my clients a polygraph exam. And I did that in Jeffrey's case, and Jeffrey passed it. The polygraph operator at that time was a guy named Paul Ballinger, who did a lot of my polygraph exams at that time. My practice also, Gareth, at that time was, if my clients passed a polygraph, with a private operator, to ask the district attorney to have their best polygraph operator also give them a test. At that time, their best polygraph operator was a guy named Captain Noble Brimer. And I arranged, I guess, with Tom Shriver to have him tested. And I remember the test was in the old Stallman building. And I stayed there during the test. I don't know, maybe it was 2 hours. And Brahma came out of the door in the Stallman building and said, "John, the boy is telling the truth."
Mm. Now, by way of background, for those who are not familiar with that case, am I correct that every day during those 33 days before her body was found, and for years actually after, this was a daily front page story?
Absolutely. I've kept several scrapbooks. I got a lot of clippings on the Marcia Trimble case.
Was it pretty obvious to you early on, John, that your client, the 15-year-old Jeffrey Womack, was a center of attention?
Absolutely. And, you know, the police wanted to convict, they wanted an arrest. The public was uneasy. People that had let their children go out and play on the streets at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening weren't letting them go anymore.
Precisely. It was a day that Nashville changed.
Absolutely, Nashville changed. Maybe some people say lost its innocence, and that may be correct.
What could you tell what it was, other than the fact that he lived in the neighborhood, that caused the DA's office to sort of zero in on Jeffrey Womack?
Absolutely, I can tell you. There was an FBI agent assigned to the case named Richard Knutson, Dick Knutson, and the FBI did a profile on who they should be looking for as the murderer of this little girl. And it came back that they needed to look for a young man that lived in the neighborhood. Of course, it turned out that was all wrong. But I think that's why they were so interested in Jeffrey Womack.
Yeah. How did the case develop after they found the body? Did it become more intense?
Oh, I think so.
Where did they find the body?
They found it in a garage on Estes Avenue, owned by John Thorpe and his wife.
Was this near both Jeff
Well,
Womack's home?
100 or 200 yards
Okay.
away.
Had it simply not been searched before?
Well, actually, there were some people that said they did search it. And that's one of the mysteries about this case, I guess. They'll never be solved.
How did were charges brought against Jeffrey Womack?
4 years later,
4 years.
he was charged with murder.
How did this time lapse happen?
Well, the truth of the matter about it, Gareth, and as you know, we're writing a book about the case. The state never had any evidence, any credible evidence that Jeffrey Womack did this.
Without sort of torpedoing your own book.
Oh, you're not going to torpedo the book.
But why were charges finally brought? What developed that?
Well, what developed was this. Shriver hired an assistant district attorney whose name was Pat Apel. He's no longer here. He may be prosecuting now in some other state. Pat Apel decided that he was going to convict Jeffrey Womack and go to the head of the Nashville bar trial lawyers. And so he got a group of police officers, including Doug Dennis and Arlene Moore and R.C. Jackson and some others whose names I can't recall right now, to go out and arrest Jeffrey at 2:00 a.m. in the morning when he didn't even have any shoes on, and try to hotbox him and get him to confess.
I take it he did not confess.
He did not, no.
Were charges brought? Was there an indictment?
No, there never was an indictment.
How did that happen?
I think by that time, Shriver deserves some credit, I guess, for not seeking an indictment, but I think he'd figured out by that time that he was going to lose.
Now, I've heard an interesting story about how you learned that there was not going to be an indictment. Is that story true?
It is true.
What happened?
Well, Ed Yarbrough and Shriver were both mountain climbers, and they were climbing a mountain somewhere in Tennessee, and Shriver told Ed that he'd made up his mind to dismiss the case. Had a big cartoon in Tennessee the next day with both of them depicted not in flattering appearance.
Did the decision not to go forward with an indictment of Jeffrey Womack, did that create a lot of news and controversy?
Oh, it did. Sure it did. And I think I told you at lunch the other day, even after Jerome Barrett was convicted, they had a call-in show where people were still saying that Jeffrey Womack was the one that did it.
Well, I feel like I'm going to be Paul Harvey now. Tell us the rest of the story. Here is Jeff Womack. He's sort of been accused and talked about in the newspapers over a period of years as a suspect. And what finally happened with that case?
Well, since Jeffrey was a juvenile at that time, first thing we had to do was get him out of jail, and we got a bond made. Dick Jenkins was the juvenile court judge, and he set a bond. And then we had a hearing to determine whether Jeffrey should be bound over and be tried as an adult. An interesting part of that story, and it'll get in the book, but it ought to really get in here too. I had a secretary at that time whose name was June Lee Cooper. She's now deceased. She got a call one day from some female who said that she worked in a homicide and that they were trying to railroad Jeffrey Womack, and she was not going to let that happen, and that she would call back from time to time and give June Lee information as to what they were doing. And she did that.
Years later, John, after this did settle down in the newspaper, I think the truth came out. And tell us about that. What finally happened?
Well, Jeffrey was bound over. Mm-hmm. Dick Jenkins bound him over. But as we've already discussed, Shriver didn't try to get an indictment. Then one day, a couple of years ago, as you know, Ed Yarbrough, my former partner, was with him 30 some odd years. He called me on the phone as U.S. Attorney and said, "John, are you sitting down?" I said, "Yeah, and I'm sitting down." He says, "They have arrested a guy for the murder of Marcia Trimble, and I believe they've got a match on his DNA."
I imagine that was a really special moment in your life.
It was a special moment. And that was Jerome Barrett. I heard the testimony of an FBI agent as an expert witness on TV. You might remember at the time one of the TV stations had the whole trial.
Yes.
On TV, and I thought she was about the best expert witness I had ever heard testify. And I put a lot of expert witnesses on the stand.
And there was a conviction.
There was a conviction, yeah.
That's a wonderful story. You mentioned another case that I think you wanted to talk about a little bit, and I'd like to hear about it. And that had to do with a gentleman named Shea.
Sherman Clayton.
Sherman Clayton. I know he was a...
No, Shaw. You're talking about Eddie Shaw.
Eddie Shaw. Tell us about the Eddie Shaw case.
Well, the state had a witness. David Rabin and Roger May tried that case. Eddie Shaw was commissioner of transportation under Ray Blanton as governor. And they had a witness named Sonny McCarter that was going to testify or did testify, I guess, that Eddie Shaw made money on the sale of surplus automobiles, equipment by the state of Tennessee. And they indicted Eddie Shaw in Chattanooga and Nashville. And my recollection is this is December of '77. And Ed and I, got ready and prepared the case for trial. And the first case came up in Chattanooga. Gary Gerbitz was the district attorney there at that time. And Ed and I went down for that case, prepared for trial. I remember we worked in the office, I think it was a Sunday the day before. And we went to court the next morning, and nobody was there from the district attorney's office. And about 11:30, Gary Gerbitz came in and dismissed the case. So that's the first case.
Interesting. All right.
Second case went to trial, and I don't know, I've got a lot of clippings about that case. We tried that case about a week. My best recollection is.
Where was that trial?
Here.
Okay.
In John Draper's court.
Okay.
And I want to say the jury's out 2.5, 3 hours and came in with a not guilty verdict.
And that was a case that was high profile.
Very high profile, yeah.
Governor Blanton was also in a good deal of controversy and eventually was indicted in federal court.
He was. And you might recall that maybe it was Joe Henry, some judge swore Lamar Alexander in early because they didn't want Ray Blanton to grant any more pardons.
I do remember that. That was a day you never forget. John, we're gonna come back to your practice, but I also wanted, before I forgot about it, to talk about a very important part of your career, and that is your service to the Bar Association. I think that during the early 1970s, you served on the Nashville Bar Association Board of Directors.
That's true.
And you also served as president.
That's right, in '74.
Tell us, as a matter of interest, and it certainly is an interest to me since I've also been active in the Bar Association, what was the association like back in the '72 through '74 period?
First, let me say that I used my own legal secretary as president of the bar. There was not funds available at that time for the bar to employ a secretary. Big difference. I knew practically everybody by name.
Yeah.
maybe 600 lawyers.
There was a time you could do that.
Time you could do that. We investigated all the grievances. We had a grievance investigating committee and a grievance committee, and we meted out justice. We investigated those cases. In some cases, we tried them and meted out justice. I can remember lawyers surrendering their license that the board of directors held for a certain period of time.
And at that time, if I understand you correctly, there were no paid employees of the Nashville Bar Association.
Well, there was a Ms. Ron that was a librarian,
That's right.
and that's the only one I remember.
At that time, the Bar Association had a library that was there in the Stallman building. Is that where the bar library was?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And were you also a member of the famous Barristers Club?
I was president of the Barristers Club.
And that was something fun, and I want to ask
Young
you
lawyers.
about it. What would the young lawyers in the Barristers Club do? What?
They get together and have a party and drink beer and whiskey. That was the main purpose of the Barristers Club.
John Kelly, I remember,
Yes.
was a member of the Barristers and very active. And
I want to say that Richard Byrd succeeded me as president
That's
of the
correct.
Barristers Club.
That's correct. And it was a wonderful way for the older and more experienced lawyers to get to know the young legal practitioners.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun.
One of the things today that I think Nashville lawyers are proudest of is sort of the coherence of the bar, and that is sort of the feeling of respect. Did you experience that from the beginning within the Nashville?
I did. When I started practicing law, although lawyers didn't make much money, you had respect. You had respect from members of the public, the news media, judges, other lawyers, and I don't think you find that same respect today. So I would differ with that idea that the bar has become better about that.
What about in terms of the things that the Bar Association did? We had a library. We would try the cases where lawyers were accused of ethical problems. What else were initiatives?
We had the annual bar picnic, which at that time was mostly held at Hobbs Farm, where you mostly drank beer and ate catfish and shook hands with the other lawyers and judges who were in attendance. But we had pro bono. We had a pro bono program then where you would be lawyer of the day.
Absolutely.
And you would sit there and interview the people, and you had a list of lawyers there, and you'd get the facts, and then you'd start calling lawyers and get somebody to represent them.
John, there came a time, and I'm guessing that it was in the 1980s or 90s, when you formed your own law firm.
76.
76.
Actually, I left the old firm in 75 and started practicing law with John Wagster, and then Ed Yarbrough came with us the next year. And that's when the firm was formed.
And where were your offices initially for that firm?
And we started off sharing space with Jim Neal's firm in the old Third National Bank building.
Right. And over the years, besides yourself and Ed Yarbrough and John Wagster, who else have you practiced with?
Aside, from Schulman, McCarley.
That's right.
Group.
Since you formed your own.
Kim Jackson was with us for a while. Aleda Arthur, who I love and who's one of my favorite people.
Now a federal judge.
Now a federal judge, was with us for a while. Nobody else. Debbie Willis.
Okay.
Debbie Willis was with us for a while, and
Was Jim Weatherly?
Jim. Well, see, Jim Weatherly and Jackie Dixon and Pat McNally have just formed their own firm in the last few months.
Right, right.
Sure, he was with us many years.
So you've actually had the experience of mentoring and practicing with a future federal judge and a future federal prosecutor.
Absolutely.
One other aspect, John, of your illustrious career that I think, and you might deny it, but I think you have a real profile in trial practice, is in divorce practice. How did
I'm going to tell you how I got into it. Alice Zimmerman was referred to me. She was married to Raymond Zimmerman. I can't remember how many years ago that was, probably 25.
Mm-hmm.
And I, handled that case and did pretty well. And then I've always known, just because of my personality, that I would probably never quit practicing law voluntarily. And I figured that I could probably practice divorce law longer than I could criminal law, or damage suits, or insurance defense.
Who are some of the sort of notable attorneys that you've practiced with in some of the high-profile divorce cases that you've had?
Jim Martin's the best.
And Jim's now gone to be
not
a judge.
A federal judge, but a judge in Williamson County, Tennessee.
Exactly.
Rose Palermo is a very good judge, a very good lawyer. Greg Smith in that firm is
Right.
certainly a good lawyer. Dorothy Pounders in Memphis is a good lawyer.
That's tough practice, isn't it?
Sure, it's tough practice. Mm-hmm. See people at the worst.
Yeah, there's so much emotion involved in divorce practice that I think a lot of practitioners shy away from it. But you've apparently been able to endure and prosper in practice. Any observations about what it takes to be a good divorce practitioner?
Well, see, I go back to those basic things. You got to have a certain amount of intelligence. You got to work like hell. You got to like to practice law. You got to like to try cases. Of course, now most cases are settled in mediation. I don't know how young lawyers are going to learn to try divorce cases, or for that matter, any other kind of case.
Well, that brings me to a question that I've wanted to ask. Everybody, as they mature in practice, makes observations about what in law or in the practice or the substance of the law has changed, and is it good or bad? Any observations?
Well, I think there's not as much respect as there was when I first started practicing law. The judges are better than when I first started practicing law. When I first started practicing law, there were colored and white water fountains in the courthouse. The courthouse was not air conditioned. The bar has helped lawyers stay up on the practice of law by conducting these various seminars. I think that's certainly been good. What I believe, Gareth, the bar and in life, what's important are relationships. And I've enjoyed very much my relationships with lawyers and staff members, judges, even witnesses, even jurors.
Exactly.
That come up to you after a trial. And
the people you meet.
Yeah, sure.
And some
I
of
like
them
people.
you get to know, and you really...
People tend to like me, so.
How about judges? Who are, if you know, you've had a long career, you've appeared probably before over 100 judges. Who
some of the
stands
best
out?
Mm-hmm. Well, Tom Higgins, of course, he's a classmate of mine. Mm-hmm. Splendid judge. We've had some good judges at the Davison County courthouse. you know, John Draper, very fine judge. Raymond Leathers, very fine judge.
And this is the same Raymond Leathers who went on to serve the Supreme Court as clerk.
That's Ramsey.
That's Ramsey. That's right. This is his brother, Raymond. That's right.
Trying to think of some others that stand out. There was a judge, Judge Pereira, that presided in Gallatin, Tennessee, was a very fine judge. Tip Taylor, who I tried the John Randolph Clark case in front of in Jackson, Tennessee, very fine judge. So I've known some great judges.
You had some observations while we talked earlier about lawyers advertising.
I don't like it. We have a website now, and the truth of the matter is, I get as many cases off the website as I do from other lawyers at this stage of my career. I'm not sure I like it. I really don't, although one of my good friends, John Day, is taken to advertise on TV, and does a good job of it. One of the best lawyers I know.
What is it about the advertising that you think may not have helped law practice?
Well, I think John Day's got very sophisticated advertising, but I think there's other advertising that's not so sophisticated. And there have been lawyers here, and some of them have made a lot of money, that have had so-called runners. They've had so-called agents among doctors, and nurses, and police officers that run them cases, and I really think that's not a problem.
John, there's so much to ask you about that I fear that I'm going to forget something about your life in the community or the things that you've done even outside of the Bar Association. Could you tell us a little bit about what other community activities you've been a part of?
Well, I've been a member of First Presbyterian Church since 1958. All my children have been raised in the church. I've been a deacon in the church. One of my favorite things at the church is my Sunday school class. I've taught Sunday school too. It's a June Ramsey class, and every Sunday we have some kind of a scholar, usually from Vanderbilt Divinity School or some other divinity school, that is able to teach us, that know more than we do, and able to teach us things we don't know about theology and religion. Last Sunday, we had a man from the Vanderbilt Divinity School talking about religion during the Revolution, and I thought that was fascinating. And it turns out that our founding fathers, maybe Ben Franklin, maybe I don't know, Alexander Hamilton, whoever else was writing the pamphlet, Sam Adams, These Are the Times That Try Men's Souls, they used religion to get the American people fired up so that they would agree or support a revolution.
There's something that some lawyers in Nashville don't know, and that is that you have a hobby that I didn't know about until about a year ago when you and I had gotten together. I forget what the occasion was, but you've written some poetry.
I write some poetry. I've written about 200 poems. Truth of the matter is, I quit walking at Radnor Lake when my wife lost a short-term memory, and I haven't written as many of them. But I got 3 privately published volumes, and I've got enough for a 4th one that I'll get done this year.
Well, I like your poetry, and I was going to end up by asking you a question of what advice you would give your son or a young man who today was thinking about going into law. But I looked, and you've got a poem called, and this is the title, So You Think You Want to Be a Lawyer. And I wanted to read a little bit of that and
Sure.
ask you 1 or 2 questions about it. And the very first part of the poem reads, "So you think you want to be a lawyer. Maybe you ought to think about that a little more. I love the law. The law is my life," an older lawyer is heard to say. "If I had plenty of money, I would still practice law because it's so rewarding. This is what I do. It makes me who I am." And it goes on, John, to say, and I'm quoting the poem, "Most lawyers don't get rich. They make a lot of money on paper. They have high overhead. They live well, but ordinarily don't die rich."
That's the way it is.
That's been my observation too. And I think a lot of lawyers voluntarily give up the opportunity to make what you might say is tons of money for the joy of practicing law.
I don't know that I've had an opportunity to make tons of money another way, but I do it. It's because I love it.
The end of the poem is especially important, and it gets back to a point you made earlier. And I really, if you'll bear with me for just another second, I want to read that. "I wouldn't want to practice law by myself. You need to have someone to cover for you when you are doing other legal work. You need to have someone to bounce ideas off of, to help you discover what you may have overlooked, or give you a sanity test from time to time. You may have completely overlooked something that should win or lose your case. You need someone to help you celebrate your victories and help you accept your losses and go on. You need someone just to be there for you." I gather that's a very important part of what you've done over your life in law.
Absolutely. That's what I believe.
And the end of the poem is, "Hell yes, you ought to be a lawyer if you're willing to pay the price."
I believe that too.
John, it has been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, Gareth.
It really has. Is there anything that you wanted to share with us, or have we covered most of the?
One other thing in that poem that I might want to mention is lawyers ought to spend a lot of time thinking about their case.
In your past, I take it there have been moments when you've had what, and I forget the lawyer who first told me this, but he said, at any moment I might have $1,000 idea. But that's happened in practice.
Sure, of course it does. But you're driving an automobile, you're shaving, you're walking at Radnor Lake, but you're still thinking about your case. And some of the best ideas you have come up during those times. Another thing that's interesting, some of the best things you say in an argument occur to you after you've gotten up and started your argument. And a lot of that's luck.
Have you ever had a case that you thought was won or lost at argument?
Absolutely, but I think I've had a lot more that were won at opening statement. I'm a great believer in opening statements.
You told me that, and I think my observation is the same as yours. It's that first impression.
Very important. I'd rather make the opening argument than the closing argument anytime.
Absolutely. John, thank you very much on behalf of the Nashville Bar and the Tennessee Bar Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.